Welcome to tonight's fantastic event of Voices Lifted, 2 Centuries of Black Composers of Opera. This is with the Opera Theater of St. Louis. This is the first of 4 presentations that the Opera Theater of St. Louis is presenting through University City Public Library. The following 3 events are happening on the next 3 Thursdays at the same time, 7 p.m. You can also use this Zoom link if you would like to attend those subsequent events as well. So before we get started, I just wanted to remind everyone to keep their Zoom accounts muted during the presentation so that we can prevent any external noise. If you do have any questions during the presentation, you can enter those into the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Otherwise, we will have a question and answer session with all of your questions and comments at the very end of the presentation. So without further ado, we have Diane McCullough here, a docent with the Opera Theater of St. Louis, going to tell us all about this wonderful, interesting topic. Take it away, Diane.
Thanks, Lindsay. So thank you, Rosemary and Ingrid, for tuning in. I will just say that both Opera Theater of St. Louis logo and Scottish Partnership for Arts and Education logo are up because Scottish Partnership is my nonprofit, and a lot of the research that was done before I decided to do this presentation, a lot of the research on the early string players and traditions was done through Scottish Partnerships. So we're both kind of sponsoring this talk. So let's get started. The COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in a flurry of new thought, which I will detail later in this talk. Opera Theater is celebrating its 45th anniversary this year and continues to develop creative new programs. This presentation will discuss the work and agency taken by Black composers of opera in the face of barriers of racism and prejudice. We will explore the musical forces that existed in both Europe and the United States that prepared these composers and subsequently placed them squarely at the heart of the development of an American sound in many genres of American music: folk, pop, jazz, and classical. And we will look at the ways that Opera Theater has responded. We begin in France before the American Revolution. Fencing master, colonel in the French Revolution, conductor, virtuoso violinist, and composer Joseph de Boulogne Chevalier de Saint-Georges, 1744 to 1799, was considered the finest violinist and conductor of its time among the nobles and royalty of 18th century France. Boulogne was born in the French Caribbean island of Guadeloupe. The son of a French plantation owner and Nanon, the enslaved woman of Senegalese origin, Nanon was 16 and Boulogne's wife's maid. From the age of 8, he was educated in France. In 1757, his father was named Gentleman of the King's Chamber, serving as a personal assistant to King Louis XV. Joseph performed as a concert violinist and conducted several orchestras at the same time, composing works for orchestra. In 1781, he became conductor of the newly formed orchestra Le Concert Olympique, which premiered and actually commissioned Haydn's 6 Paris symphonies in 1786, with Queen Marie Antoinette in attendance. Although he was renowned as a soloist, conductor, and composer, he was met with barriers when trying to get his operas performed. When he applied for the directorship of the Paris Opera, 3 of the company's leading sopranos declared that they would not work under the direction of a mixed-race person. Nevertheless, he wrote several operas, managing to get performances in smaller private theaters. Los Angeles Opera presented the American premiere of his opera, The Anonymous Lover, in a virtual performance on November 14th, 2020, Here is a brief excerpt. Bologna was seminal in developing a uniquely French genre for orchestra called the Symphonie Concertante, a hybrid of the Baroque concerto grosso and the classical concerto. A symphonic concertante usually featured two or more soloists in a virtuosic dialogue that emulated a musical duel. Bologna wrote 8 such pieces between 1775 and 76, a testament to the demand for them among French audiences. In 1778, Mozart traveled to Paris, staying from March to September and briefly under the same roof as Bologna, hosted by Count Sickingen. It is implausible, to say the least, that Mozart did not hear Bologna's music during this period. Intriguingly, Mozart's first composition after his return to Austria was his Symphonie Concertante in E-flat, Köchel 364. And in an article published in 1990 in the Black Music Research Journal, Gabriel Banat points to the remarkable similarities between an excerpt from a Bologna Violin Concerto, Opus 7, number 1, from 1777, and a passage from Mozart's Köchel 364 from the following year, 1778. The gesture in question recurs in Bologna's solo string writing. A difficult sequence climbing to the highest register of the instrument, immediately followed by a dramatic dip, but had never appeared in Mozart's work until this presto in Köchel 364. Here is an example from the Allegro in Bologna's Symphonie Concertante in G, played by the Buscade Orchestra of South Africa. Celtic and West African string ensemble traditions. Although it is not known whether Joseph Bologna's mother was a musician, the Senegalese have a long tradition of string music, both bowed instruments and plucked instruments. This is true of other West African cultures as well. In her book, Fiddling in West Africa, Jacqueline Cogdell JJ lists 89 different ethnic groups in 16 countries where a one-stringed bowed instrument is played, an instrument like this riti. The riti is the Wolof word for that instrument, but it has words, it has other names, of course, in other languages. Instruments such as the kora and the riti correspond to the Celtic harp and the eventual use of the violin or fiddle in traditional music of the Celts of Scotland, Ireland, Brittany, and Gaul. Players of the kora and the Celtic harp were even used in similar ways. The players were the clan historians, and they served the clan chiefs. In Mali and the Senegambia, kora players are in guilds made up of families that specialize in learning the histories and playing and singing them. The apprenticeship is a 7-year process where traditionally the son would go to an uncle for his 7 years of training. At the end of the 7 years, he was required to go from town to town, demonstrating that he knew all the histories and the music. Let's listen to the African Classical Music Ensemble and Kase Made Diabate. The English translation of the story he is telling is There Was a Time. You can hear how operatic this music is.
Kirifia boka kona te karafaga. Soko soko simoni siko salaba ya kumanu kamana siyo. Marigando rusowa karamani somo mane somo fono mati sumalaga. Danya mo kumoba kelelo. Kumoba kelelo.
Both the kora and the Celtic harp are now played by both men and women, and players are playing both traditional tunes as well as composing their own tunes. It is not surprising that when enslaved West Africans were brought to the Americas, there were many musicians among them. At the same time, in colonial America, there were fiddle players from Scotland and Ireland. Old Williamsburg, Virginia, has documented the music being played there for dances and concerts, and most of it was Scottish in the earliest days. Robert Burns and other poets and folklore-loving Scots had begun collecting the poetry and song of their oral traditions. And by the late 17th century, these tunes were being published both in Scotland and England. Many of these publications have been found in Old Williamsburg and are listed in the replica manuscripts. Also found in the replicas is the mention that many of the fiddlers at the dances were Black. Black fiddlers were both enslaved people and freed people. Being a musician was a skill that provided a bit of freedom to enslaved musicians and a bit of income to freed Black musicians. Enslaved musicians were rented out, and most of the money they earned went to the white enslaver. There are many stories, however, of freedom being bought by these musicians after years of saving the small wages that they may have received. As you can see in this picture, there is a fiddler, and toward the back, there's a mandolin player. As people moved west, both Black and white musicians carried the music via the Ohio River Valley and into Missouri and the Missouri River plantations. Black fiddlers were still playing for both Black and white dance parties all over Missouri as late as the 1940s and 50s. Bill Driver and Bill Caton are two of the most famous, and their music can be found on recordings. You can Google them. This brings us to the question of the music of Appalachia, which has been portrayed as a strictly Anglo and Scots-Irish phenomenon. This notion was introduced in the late 19th century by several early ethnomusicologists that visited Appalachia with the newly invented recording machines they brought to document their work. This was at the beginning of Jim Crow laws that codified racial segregation, and these writers played right into that mentality. Recent research is slowly disproving this monochromatic view. A terrific source of information can be found in Phil Jamison's book, Hoedowns, Reels, and Frolics, Roots and Branches of Southern Appalachian Dance. It was the recording industry that greatly influenced our concepts of who played which music. Marketing strategies separated race music from old time and later country and bluegrass. Recording companies were willing to record Black musicians who played the blues, but increasingly less willing to present them playing other forms of popular music. Why have I spent so much time on roots of our folk music? Because just like with baseball or basketball, the more homemade ball fields and hoops people are playing with, the more players prepare themselves for an opportunity to make that sport their life's work. You can say the same for music. The more skill you build and the greater the pool of players, the more likely it is that musicians will explore other forms of music. The other thing is, symphonic and operatic forms of classical music require string players, and these string players were playing folk music. Black musicians were hearing the classical music of their times and also learning to read music. Many references are made to the musicians connected with the Hemmingses of Monticello and surrounding towns. Biographies of great Black Americans, from abolitionists to military men to poets, tell us that most played violin and many also played piano and could play popular folk and classical music. Frederick Douglass is probably, I think I missed a slide here. Yeah. As you can see here, Paul Laurence Dunbar, the poet, was also a musician, and Colonel Charles Young, the Buffalo Soldier officer, was a musician and was instrumental actually in introducing Varese and William Grant Still. So Frederick Douglass is probably the most famous of these. His wife, Anna Murray Douglass, was a free woman and professional violin teacher in Baltimore. She read music and played both classical and fiddle styles. Douglass went to her for lessons while he was still enslaved, and one of their grandsons, Joseph Douglass, became a concert violinist and taught at Howard University. The musical milieu for 19th century Black Americans was deep and rich. There were many instrumentalists, fiddlers, violinists, pianists, and much more. When musicians didn't have a violin, they would make one from any number of materials, including corn stalks. Classical music was studied and played in concert. The violin was the lead instrument in very early New Orleans jazz groups. This is an area waiting for more musicological research. This leads us to our opera composers. You can see Jimmy Palao is there with his violin, second from the right, seated. John Thomas Douglas, 1847 to 1886. In 1868, his opera, Virginia's Ball, was copyrighted. This title is logical for 1868. Douglass would have known the connection between Virginia balls and Black musicians. It was performed at least once that year at the Stuyvesant Institute on Broadway, but has been lost. Douglass was a renowned violinist, toured as a concert artist, and played in a string ensemble and in minstrel orchestras, including Hyers Sisters and Georgia Minstrels. And I'm learning that the Black-run minstrel groups and touring groups usually included opera in their performances. Harry Lawrence Freeman, 1869 to 1854, grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. By the age of 10, he was playing organ in church. At 18, he began composing, having been inspired by attending a performance of Wagner's Tannhäuser. By age 22, he was in Denver and had founded the Freeman Opera Company and the Freeman School of Music. In 1891, his opera Epithalia was performed at the Deutsches Theater in Denver. His second opera, The Martyr, premiered there in 1893. The Martyr was also produced by the Freeman Opera Company, later in Chicago and Cleveland. This was the first opera in the USA to be produced by an all-Black production company. He moved back to Cleveland, married, and continued composing and teaching in Cleveland, Chicago, and at Wilberforce University. About 1908, the family moved to Harlem, where in 1912, he helped Scott Joplin with revisions to his opera, Treemonisha, which was produced by Opera Theater in 2000. Freeman composed at least 23 operas, many of which were successful in his lifetime, but are not performed today. He was a colleague of musicians and artists in New York and is associated with the Harlem Renaissance. There is an archive of most of his scores and his papers at Columbia University in New York. Will Marion Cook, 1869 to 1944, composer, violinist, choral director, student of Antonin Dvorak, and composed in many forms, including musical comedy, jazz, popular song. Cook's father, John Hartwell Cook, became one of the first African-American lawyers in Washington, D.C. He was chief clerk of the Freedmen's Bureau from 1867 to 1872 and served as professor and dean of the Howard University Law School from 1876 to 78. He and his wife, Isabel, were free people of color before the Civil War and stressed education. The younger Cook showed musical talent at an early age and began studying violin at Oberlin at age 14. He was exposed to African-American spirituals while living with his grandparents in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and these melodies stayed with him throughout his professional music career. His Broadway musicals made great use of these melodies and of popular dance forms like the cakewalk. Although his concertizing was short-lived because of strict segregation of performers in the classical music community, he was nevertheless famous as a concert artist on violin. His stage works were performed on Broadway by the Black-owned company of the Johnson Brothers. Clarence Cameron White, 1880 to 1960, was the son of highly educated parents. His mother was a violinist, having studied at Oberlin. After his father's death, when White was 2, his mother moved back to Oberlin, where White's grandfather gave him his violin with the stipulation that he never play dance music. In 1890, his mother remarried, and they moved back to Washington, D.C., where White had the chance to hear Will Marion Cook in concert 2 years later. He was only 12 years old and fell asleep before Cook played. When he woke up and realized he had missed the performance, he was inconsolable. Cook heard about this and offered White violin lessons in the summer of 1892. Among other famous solo artists that taught White were Samuel Coleridge Taylor in London, and at Howard University, Joseph Douglas, the grandson of abolitionist Frederick Douglass, mentioned earlier. White's career included performing, teaching, writing violin pedagogy, and composing. He wrote the opera Uwanga, which is based on Haitian themes. William Grant Still, 1895 to 1978, composer of 150 works, although we've learned recently that it was probably 200 works, including 5 ballets, 5 symphonies, and 8 operas. The best known of these composers Still was the first African-American composer to have an opera produced by the New York City Opera. Born in Mississippi, he grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas. Still studied violin at age 15 and was self-taught on many other instruments before graduating high school at 16. He went to Wilberforce University, Oberlin Conservatory of Music, and was a student of George Whitfield Chadwick and Edgar Varese in composition. Howard Hanson considered Still to be the premier American composer and premiered many of his works at the Eastman School of Music with the Eastman Rochester Symphony. Still was the first African-American to conduct a major American symphony orchestra, have a symphony, his first symphony, performed by a leading orchestra, have an opera performed by a major opera company, and first to have an opera performed on national television. He had a close association with Alain Locke and Langston Hughes and is considered part of the Harlem Renaissance. He worked with Freeman, Cook, and White, and mentored younger Black composers such as Ulysses Kay. Still is an excellent example of the career trajectory of most African-American classically trained musicians. He found work from 1919 on, arranging music for popular bands, starting with Fletcher Henderson and moving on to Paul Whiteland in 1929. Meantime, he played in the pit orchestra for U.B. Blake's musical Shuffle Along and was the arranger of Yamacraw, a Negro Rhapsody, composed by the noted Harlem stride pianist James P. Johnson. In the 1930s and 40s, he arranged for Willard Robeson's Deep River Hour and Paul Whiteman's Old Gold Show, both popular NBC radio broadcasts, as well as arranging for films starring Bing Crosby, Jane Wyeth, and Ronald Colman, among others. In 1936, he conducted the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra, becoming the first African American to conduct a major symphony orchestra in the USA. He went on to conduct other major orchestras, and his works have been played by the Berlin Philharmonic, the St. Louis Symphony, and many other orchestras. Here is an excerpt from the finale of the fourth movement of his Afro-American Symphony from 1930. His orchestration of the winds and his billowing effect, where the music seems to billow like clouds out of itself, is characteristic of his sound. Hearing of all these successes, one would think that William Grant Still was one of the lucky ones who was allowed to find success. But the truth is that Still had to face many instances of racist decisions about whether or not he would have success. The most tragic incident, though, was surrounding his opera Troubled Island, written in 1938 with the libretto by Langston Hughes and Verna Arvey, but not produced until 1949. The New York City Opera took on the project, and expectations were extremely high because of the successes of Still's symphonic works. Everyone connected with the production anticipated a huge success. The work was contracted for 3 performances over a 6-week time span. Before the first performance, John Briggs, music critic for the New York Post, told Still that all of the critics were going to pan his opera, and in fact, that is what happened. Even though there were 22 curtain calls for the composer at the end of the first performance, the critics were determined to scuttle the whole show. After the third contracted performance, the opera has never been performed again. Here is Celeste's opening aria, which comes just after a very short overture. This opera is about the Haitian Revolution, and the lead character is Dessalines. This was a very popular topic in the 30s, 20s and 30s in the Harlem Renaissance. So the text is, little black slave child, no slave to me. You are my son, child, who must be free. We are here, child, no place to rest. Lay your dark head, child, on mother's breast. Sleep now, my baby. Sleep now, my son. Mother will free you ere night is done. Dream your sweet dreams, child, that have no name. Mother will dream now a dream of flame, flame that will sweep our slavery away. Sleep on, my little one, till the new day. Sleep on, my little one, till the new day. This was recorded at the premiere in 1949. What these composers had in common, they were all multi-talented, all were multi-instrumentalists, all made their living in popular forms of music and or entertainment in vogue at their time. All were prepared for careers in classical music, but faced racism and segregation. All were entrepreneurial and created their own opportunities where they could. After Still's rejection in New York, most opportunities for Black composers were found in college and university settings, where both jazz and new classical music were being premiered. New York City Opera waited 37 years until 1986 when they staged Anthony Davis's X, The Life and Times of Malcolm X, before they premiered another opera by a Black composer. Opera Theater of St. Louis has staged a revival of one and premiered 4 operas by Black composers. They are Under the Double Moon, Anthony Davis, 1989. Joshua's Boots, Adolphus Hailstork, 1999, an opera for youth. Champion by Terence Blanchard, 2013. Fire Shut Up in My Bones by Terence Blanchard, 2019. Treemonisha, Scott Joplin, 2000. And included in Opera Theater's 2021 season is William Grant Still's one-act opera, Highway 1 USA. Terence Blanchard quoted the great Wayne Shorter, one of his mentors, as saying, "Luck equals preparation plus opportunity." For preparation, he advised Blanchard to go down to the basement and find every note. In other words, dig deep. The composers mentioned here clearly were prepared, and a couple of them had opportunities while still living. Blanchard commented that for every Black musician that rises to the surface, there are at least 10 just as good who have been prepared but did not have opportunity. In Blanchard's case, Opera Theater of St. Louis's Jim Robinson and Tim O'Leary, general director at the time, asked for a second opera after opening night of Champion in 2013. It took a year to find the right material, and the rest is history. The Met will open their 2021 season with Fire Shut Up in My Bones. This will be the first time that the Met has ever presented an opera by a Black composer. Terence Blanchard continues a line of African-American musicians who, yes, compose opera and also are jazz composers and work in popular mediums, whether it be dance music, musicals, or film and TV. White American classical composers have borrowed massively from these musicians. Just as jazz is America's classical music, it is to these musicians that we need to look for a dynamic, synchronatic future for American opera. Under General Director Andrew Jorgensen, Opera Theater continues its commitment to Black opera composers and further into diversifying the administration and backstage aspects of opera theater. They have announced 2 new programs, CLACO, Future Leaders Fellowship, and the Voices Fund, a path for empathy, dialogue, and change. The Voices Fund started with a joint concert with 9PBS on November 23rd, 2020, featuring Angel Riley, and continued with a holiday concert and opera on the go, Pirates of Penzance, filmed in the film studio that Opera Theater created in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. But just recently, April 6th and 13th, Opera Theater joined with Washington U in a symposium called Belonging in Opera, Learning from Our Past, Engaging with Our Future. And I recommend this to everyone. It is on YouTube, and you can find it there. Belonging in Opera is the beginning of the title for that. The CLACO Fellows, who are active as we speak here at Opera Theater, are Leanne Alvarado, Administrative Fellow, Chandler Johnson, who's in the center, who is Advancement Fellow, and Quentin Beverly is the Artistic Fellow. These composers, Stephen Mackey, Damian Sneed, and Laura Cartman, are part of the New Works Bold Voices Lab. And they were originally scheduled for the film studio, but that had to be postponed. So now this work will be part of the regular season starting at the end of May. They each have composed a 20-minute opera. The crowning glory, of course, of our season is the festival season. And, oops. Okay, I'm going to leave that there because I don't know how that happened. So it begins with Johnny Schicchi by Puccini, then goes to Highway 1 USA, William Grant Still, and then Poulenc's La Voix Humaine. And then we will have a Juneteenth concert called I Dream a World. We'll have New Works, Bold Voices in the season, and the Center Stage concert featuring our young artists. These new programs continue a long history of opera theater reaching out to underserved communities in the St. Louis region. Their artist in training program for high school singers celebrated its 28th year this spring. I've already mentioned the New Works Bold Voices. The Opera on the Go was used by at least 200 schools worldwide, as far afield as Japan. I do want to mention that the 2021 season marks the 44th year that the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra will be partnered with opera theater. And I want to also mention that Leonard Slatkin, who was conductor of the St. Louis Symphony for many, many years, will be the conductor for both Johnny Schicchi and Highway 1 USA. And the director for Highway 1 USA is Ron Himes from the Black Rep. So and many of the young artists who went through the artist in training program with us will be performing and have participated in the panels. They've had professional careers now for years. So that ends my presentation. I want to point out that these programs all reflect Opera Theater's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Opera Theater is leading the way. Will we, as audience members, arts supporters, and producers provide the opportunity for all those who are prepared? Opera Theater believes it is a priority. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing and so.
Great. Thank you, Diane. This was wonderful. What a wealth of information. And I know we're just barely scratching the surface with all of these composers and performers through our history here in the United States. And
I want to point out that Lindsay sent you, I think, the narration, which is fully footnoted, so that the statements that I made throughout are footnoted in that document. And this is the actual book, Fiddling in West Africa. So it's quite an amazing, it's a scholarly treatise. So it's very tiny print. If you're interested in reading about William Grant Still, I recommend, there are quite a few books about him because he and Verna Arvey, their daughter, Judith Ann Still, revived their music publishing company called the William Grant Still Music Company. And Judith Ann collected all the works, the boxes full of documents that her parents had collected. And she found this manuscript that her mother had written, a biography of William Grant Still. And it's In One Lifetime. Verna Arvey. And it is just fantastic because, of course, she has all these intimate stories about their life. And one of the things that I discovered in that book was that, and I had read that William Grant Still had studied with Edgar Varese, but I didn't know how they had really gotten together. And it turns out that that colonel of the Buffalo Soldiers, Colonel Young, Charles Young, actually met Varese on a steamboat to Europe. And since the colonel was such a musician himself, I have a notebook this full of his music that he wrote. He even taught music at Wilberforce for a little while when he was teaching the military things there for a while. But at any rate, he knew William Grant Still, and when he learned that Varese was looking for students to apply for scholarships for studying composition, Charles Young recommended William Grant Still, and that's how they got together. So, you know, it's just quite amazing, the stories that this book tells about their lives. They were also very spiritual people, and so everything like that happened meant something very deep for them. So are there questions? Let's see, I see a chat.
We did have a question wondering about whether the this coming season for the Opera Theater is going to be streamed or available to view virtually. Do you know offhand?
I think it is. Ingrid, are you still there?
Uh-oh.
You're muted. Ingrid is going to be presenting for you as well. There she is.
Yeah,
Ingrid,
yeah, I think they film every opera, and then after the season, I think it will be available.
Yes.
It will be
Yeah.
streamed, yeah.
And I think they're still planning to videotape La Boheme and make that available at some point. They had to with the surge of COVID cases in January and February, they had to postpone.
Yeah.
They were originally going to tape the new works, Bold Voices and La Boheme, and play them before the season started, but they couldn't do that. They also were originally planning to do Harvey Milk, the true story of what happened with him. But it turns out that, they've postponed that to next season because of basically they needed to keep everything down to a one act time period to be safe for this summer.
Yeah, they don't have enough seats, I think. But anyway, what I found interesting, you know, that Puccini was also a student of Varese, but he decided after a while, he decided he was too modern for him. He chose more the 19th century type music. Actually, like Still, I mean, they're very similar, aren't they?
Actually, William Grant Still decided the Varese was too modern for him too. He did agree, he loved Puccini, and he did agree that the audience was as important as anybody else. And so he wanted to do stories that the audience would really find an emotional connection to.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It's so amazing because I read again in one lifetime, I think, Puccini had just died when William Grant Still was really becoming very famous. I mean, you know, you don't always connect Puccini as living that long into the 20th century.
Yeah.
You know, but he did, and he was a huge influence. And Butterfly wasn't even premiered here. It wasn't even written until after 1900. So we don't always think of him as a 20th century composer, but he was.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I'm surprised. Yeah.
I'll do a little plug in that in 2 weeks on April 29th, we are, our opera theater event is for William Grant Still's Highway 1 USA. So you can tune back in to dive into that particular piece.
I'll be tuning in too, because I'm presenting that opera as a different production too, but I'm not presenting that opera for you.
Yeah.
Chiquita Jackson is presenting it that night too. So, and Ingrid, I'll probably see you next week too. So it's so good to have the link for everything, Lindsay. I'm glad to have that. It makes it so easy for us to keep track of everybody else.
So did I was it all right to tune in? Because you sent the link to me.
Oh, yes.
Can I give it to other people too?
Yes, actually, yeah. We can talk about this in just a moment. If I think we might have, do we have any more questions to ask of Diane?
I think it was very interesting and very enlightening. I think it's such a shame that these people were so sidelined, and that a very vocal group initiated that pretty late, actually, in the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's really a shame. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm glad that at least they get some more attention now.
Agreed.
I think it's worth it for everybody to really look up the symposium that was done last 2 Tuesdays. It's such high level scholarship and really insightful comments, and covers the breadth of the operatic world, from administrative through the composition of the operas and the performing of them, and the studying the history. It has a little bit of everything from real scholars, and I really recommend watching that. Rosemary, it seemed like you wanted to say something.
Oh, I just wanted to tell you how much I enjoyed this, and I just thought it was fascinating as well as infuriating. Like she said, just how much you don't learn and know. So I'm super excited for the rest of the sessions.
Well, Lindsay, I hope that I don't know if you'll be able to tell whether people are doing the live stream.
I can, yes.
Will you be able to tell?
Yes.
So I hope you'll send